He was just her employee, until one look made him question everything he thought he knew about desire, boundaries, and himself. The first time I saw her, I was caught off guard, not by her appearance, though she was undeniably striking, but by the quiet command she seemed to carry effortlessly. She moved through the office as if the space itself acknowledged her presence, every step measured, deliberate, yet entirely natural. There was a grace to her that was impossible to ignore, a subtle confidence that didn't need to announce itself. I noticed the way her heels clicked softly on the polished floor, the gentle sway of her hair brushing her shoulders as she walked, the way she paused at my desk for a moment longer than strictly necessary before offering her introduction. She was older, of course, older than anyone I had been close to in a professional sense. That age brought with it an air of sophistication, but also a warmth I hadn't expected. Her voice was calm, smooth, carrying a steady cadence that somehow made everything she said feel important. When she spoke to me, I couldn't help but notice the way her eyes held mine, the slight tilt of her head as if she were quietly assessing, not judging, but simply observing. There was no urgency in her movements, no need to fill the space with words or gestures, yet her presence was immediately palpable. I felt my pulse quicken the moment our hands brushed briefly when she passed me a folder. It was a fleeting contact, just a second or two, yet it lingered in a way that made me acutely aware of her proximity. It wasn't the touch itself, it was the context, the combination of her closeness, her poise, and the warmth that seemed to radiate from her. My chest tightened just a little, and I had to remind myself to focus on the task at hand. There was something else too, something subtle that drew my attention, the small details she didn't realize I noticed. The faint, pleasant scent she carried, soft and understated, like clean linen or a hint of vanilla. The way her fingers lingered on the edge of a desk as she leaned slightly closer to point something out. The almost imperceptible softness in her expression when she smiled politely, not the wide grin of casual acquaintances, but something quieter, more thoughtful, as if she were saving her full warmth for the right moments. I tried to keep my professional composure, reminding myself that she was my boss, someone I respected and whose authority I needed to honor. Yet, even in that first meeting, there was a magnetic pull I couldn't ignore. I found myself lingering on the way she moved, how she spoke, how her presence seemed to fill the room without demanding attention. I felt an odd mixture of admiration, nervous excitement, and an almost instinctual awareness that this encounter, simple as it seemed on the surface, might mark the beginning of something that would quietly, persistently grow. And as she finally turned to leave, giving me a nod that was both professional and unexpectedly personal, I realized I was already counting the moments until our next meeting. Something about her presence had unsettled me in the best possible way, leaving me both grounded in reality and aware of a strange, thrilling anticipation I couldn't yet name. The next few days I found myself more aware of her than I wanted to admit. At first, I told myself it was simply the novelty of a new boss, the kind of attentiveness one might naturally give when trying to make a good impression. But it quickly became something else entirely, a quiet awareness that lingered even when I wasn't near her. I noticed the way she seemed to glide through the office, not rushing, never flustered, yet managing to command every conversation with an understated authority. There was a rhythm to her presence that made the rest of the world feel a little slower, a little softer. She began to offer guidance more directly, small corrections or suggestions that felt unexpectedly personal. Not in a patronizing way, far from it, but in a way that made me feel seen. When she leaned over my shoulder to point at a detail in a report, our hands brushed just lightly, and the contact, brief though it was, left a warmth behind. I could feel the tiniest spark of awareness along my skin, and I realized, with a mix of embarrassment and fascination, that she had no idea how deliberate, or how significant, her small gestures were to me. I caught her watching me on a few occasions. Always subtle, never obvious, but enough that I would feel a jolt in my chest when our eyes met. There was no judgment in her gaze, only something that felt like curiosity, like she was trying to understand me as easily as she understood the work in front of her. Each time our eyes met, there was a pause, a lingering beat where the office faded just slightly from my awareness, leaving only her. The world outside that tiny sphere seemed to quiet, and in those moments I realized that I was waiting for her glance, almost craving it without admitting it even to myself. Even our silences carried weight. Conversations sometimes ended with a pause, either of us rushing to fill it, and those pauses were heavier than the words themselves. I could feel a subtle tension, unspoken but undeniable, that vibrated between us like a string pulled taut. It was thrilling and unsettling all at once, like standing on the edge of something you didn't fully understand but couldn't wait to explore. There were other small things, too. The tilt of her head when she smiled politely, the faint warmth of her breath as she spoke near my desk, the quiet strength in her hands when she rested them on the edge of the table. Each detail layered on the last, creating an awareness I couldn't shake, even in moments when I tried to focus purely on work. By the end of the week, I realized that what I felt was no longer about admiration or professional respect alone. Something more complicated had taken root, something delicate, quiet, and deeply stirring. I couldn't tell if it was safe to acknowledge it, or even if it was entirely appropriate, but the thought of her, the memory of her touch, the weight of her gaze, lingered long after I left the office each day. I was aware, perhaps painfully so, that this was only the beginning, and that every glance, every touch, would carry meaning far beyond the surface of our professional interactions. That evening, the office was quieter than usual. Most of the staff had already left, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft shuffle of papers. I hadn't expected to stay late, but a last-minute report required attention, and somehow, she was still there too. I felt a flicker of anticipation mixed with a slight pang of guilt. After all, this was work, not some clandestine meeting. And yet, when our eyes met across the room, the tension that had been quietly simmering over the past week seemed to thicken, almost tangible. She leaned against her desk, arms crossed, the soft glow from her lamp casting shadows that highlighted the elegance in her posture. There was a warmth in her presence that made the ordinary office feel suddenly intimate, like the space had contracted around us. When she spoke, it wasn't the boss speaking, it was the woman herself, calm and approachable, her tone low and measured. Each word seemed to draw me closer, not in some dramatic, impossible way, but gently, persistently, until I felt the pull of her attention as keenly as my own heartbeat. At one point, she came over to help with a section of the report I was struggling with. Our shoulders brushed lightly as we leaned toward the same document. That contact, so ordinary in itself, seemed to linger in the air long after our hands separated. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, an awareness that this closeness, brief as it was, carried weight far beyond the work at hand. Her fingers hovered near mine as she pointed to a line, just enough that I could feel the faint electricity of proximity, and yet not so much that it felt inappropriate. It was a careful balance, one that left both of us suspended in that quiet, charged moment. I noticed details I hadn't before, the slight incline of her head when she considered my answer, the way her eyes softened when she smiled, almost imperceptibly, and the quiet steadiness in her breathing, even when we were close. There was a rhythm to her movements, a fluid grace that made every gesture seem intentional yet effortless. I found myself tracking these subtleties, almost compulsively, as if memorizing them would somehow help me navigate the growing tension between us. We spoke less about work than usual. The conversation meandered, touching on books she liked, the music playing softly from the office radio, small observations about life outside the office. And in those moments, her vulnerability, carefully masked behind professionalism during the day, became visible. Her laugh was low, genuine, unguarded, and for a moment I felt I was seeing a side of her few others ever did. There was trust implicit in that, an unspoken understanding that made the distance between us feel smaller, more intimate. When the clock finally reminded us it was late, I realized I hadn't wanted this evening to end, not the quiet conversation, not the proximity, not the gentle warmth of her presence that lingered on my skin and in my mind. As she straightened, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, I felt an unfamiliar tug of hesitation. I wanted to linger, to say more, to explore the quiet current between us, but I also knew this was a moment to hold on to in memory rather than action. And as I packed up my things, I understood with startling clarity that something unspoken had begun between us, something patient, persistent, and impossible to ignore. It was one of those evenings where the office felt smaller than usual, the hum of the air conditioner, and the soft buzz of fluorescent lights forming a quiet cocoon around us. I was reviewing a report when she walked past my desk, leaning slightly closer than necessary to whisper a comment that made me startle in a way I tried to hide. "Stay out of trouble," she said, her voice low, almost conspiratorial, carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. Her eyes met mine for a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than it should have. There was something in the look she gave me, something that flickered between amusement and something far deeper, something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't flirtation in the obvious sense, not a teasing smile or a suggestive tone. It was subtler, quieter, the kind of look that made you aware of every tiny detail, the way her cheek caught the light, the gentle slope of her jaw, the slight softness of her expression as she observed me. I could feel the heat rise in my own face, a flush that had nothing to do with the office temperature. She lingered for a second longer than necessary, just enough that our shoulders brushed lightly as she passed. It wasn't an accident. Her presence, her touch, the closeness, all seemed deliberate in the way that made the ordinary feel charged. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, warm and subtle, that seemed to envelop the space between us and stay with me long after she walked away. I felt it settle in my chest, an invisible tether that pulled me toward her in ways I hadn't yet begun to understand. The comment itself, playful though it was, carried an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. There was a careful balance in her tone, a mixture of caution and unspoken curiosity. It made me conscious of my every movement, every word, as though simply existing in that space with her was enough to generate tension. Even the act of looking at her felt loaded, each blink and glance weighted with an unspoken acknowledgement that something was shifting between us. I tried to focus on my work, but her presence lingered in my mind. Every detail replayed itself, the way her hand had briefly touched my arm, the quiet steadiness in her gaze, the soft inflection in her voice. I realized that I was acutely aware of how close we had been, and how much that proximity affected me, emotionally and physically. It was disarming, exhilarating, and slightly frightening all at once. There was a strange kind of intimacy in that small interaction, in the way she had whispered that simple phrase. It wasn't just a warning, it was a moment that bridged distance, a private exchange layered with meaning that only we seemed to share. I understood, with an almost painful clarity, that our relationship had begun to shift in that fleeting instant, and that every subsequent glance, every brush of hands, would carry the weight of this unspoken tension. By the time she walked away completely, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the office, I felt my heart still racing. It wasn't just the thrill of her proximity, it was the realization that I was no longer just noticing her. I was aware, in a way that felt dangerously consuming, of the pull she exerted, the subtle ways she drew me in, and the silent, slow current that had begun to flow between us. After that evening, I found it increasingly difficult to separate my work from the way I felt about her. Each interaction carried a weight I hadn't anticipated, and I realized, with a mix of fascination and unease, that I was thinking about her constantly. The brief touches, the lingering glances, even the soft, quiet way she moved through the office, they all left impressions on me that refused to fade. It was as if the air itself shifted whenever she was near, subtle and unassuming, yet impossible to ignore. I began to question myself. Was it appropriate to feel this way about my boss, someone clearly older and more experienced, someone whose world and responsibilities were so different from my own? Every time our eyes met, every time her hand brushed mine, even for the briefest moment, I felt a tug in my chest that was both thrilling and troubling. I tried to reason it away, to chalk it up to admiration or the natural curiosity of someone new in a professional environment, but deep down, I knew it was something more. Something persistent. She seemed aware of it too, in her own way. There were moments when her eyes would linger on me just slightly longer than necessary, or when a soft smile would touch her lips in a way that suggested she knew exactly what I was feeling. And yet, she never crossed any boundaries, never made me uncomfortable, never betrayed the professional decorum that separated us. Instead, she walked a careful line, close enough to make my pulse quicken, far enough to keep the tension simmering rather than boiling over. I noticed the little things more than ever: the light brush of her fingers when she handed me a pen, the warmth of her hand near mine when we reached for the same file, the way she shifted in her chair to face me fully during a conversation. Each gesture was fleeting, but it left a mark, a subtle awareness that made me hyper-conscious of her presence. Even when she wasn't near, I could feel the memory of her proximity, like an echo of warmth lingering on my skin. The hesitation on both sides was palpable. I wanted to reach for her, to bridge the distance, yet I held back. I could sense her restraint as well, the slight pauses before she spoke, the careful placement of her hands on the desk, the way she allowed herself a momentary smile before resuming her professional composure. It was as if we were both testing the waters, aware of the risk and yet unable to resist the pull entirely. And so, every day became a negotiation between desire and propriety. I watched, I waited, and I learned the subtle rhythms of her presence. Each glance, each gesture, each quiet smile carried unspoken meaning, and I found myself learning to read her like a language all our own. It was exhausting and exhilarating at the same time, an emotional balancing act that left me constantly on edge, yet deeply aware that something meaningful was quietly developing between us. By the end of the week, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't fleeting, nor was it purely a product of circumstance. The tension, the attraction, the restrained intimacy, it was real, undeniable, and growing. And I realized with a startling clarity that the hardest part wasn't resisting it. It was imagining a world in which I didn't give in, at least in thought, to the pull of her presence. The late-night office was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the gentle tapping of keyboards. A project had unexpectedly landed on our desks, and we were forced to work side by side longer than usual. At first, I tried to keep my focus on the numbers and charts before me, but it quickly became impossible. Her presence had a gravity I couldn't ignore, drawing my attention even when I forced myself to look away. At one point, we both reached for the same document. Our hands collided lightly, the brief contact lingering longer than either of us intended. I felt the warmth of her skin, the subtle pressure of her fingers brushing against mine, and for a moment, the office seemed to shrink around us. My heartbeat quickened, a low hum in my ears, and I realized that this simple, accidental touch carried more meaning than anything either of us had said aloud. We worked in silence for a few moments, but the quiet wasn't uncomfortable, it was intimate. I noticed the way her hair fell softly over her shoulder as she leaned slightly toward the document, the soft glow of her desk lamp highlighting the curve of her profile. There was a natural elegance in every motion, a quiet confidence that made it impossible not to watch her. And yet beneath that composure, I sensed a vulnerability I hadn't seen before, a small crack in the armor of professionalism that made her feel suddenly, achingly human. Eventually, the silence gave way to conversation, but not about work. She spoke softly about small things: a book she'd recently enjoyed, a memory from her weekend, the music playing faintly from a radio somewhere in the office. Her voice was calm and deliberate, but there was a warmth in it that made me lean closer without realizing. I found myself opening up too, speaking honestly about thoughts and feelings I usually kept to myself. There was an unexpected trust in the exchange, a sense that the distance created by age, authority, and professionalism could be temporarily set aside. I caught myself stealing glances at her, noticing the small gestures I had come to memorize, the subtle shift of her weight, the way her fingers lingered near the edge of the desk, the curve of her smile when she laughed quietly. And she seemed to notice me too, in small, imperceptible ways, the gentle tilt of her head, the softening of her gaze, the brief brush of her hand when handing me a pen. Each moment built on the last, creating a current of tension and connection that neither of us could ignore. By the time the project was complete, I felt a strange mixture of relief and reluctance. The office, once so ordinary, now seemed charged with the quiet energy of what had passed between us. I realized that in these small, carefully measured interactions, we had crossed a threshold, an emotional breakthrough, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't dramatic or loud, it was quiet, intimate, and profound. And in that moment, I understood that what had begun as fleeting awareness and gentle attraction had grown into something much deeper, a connection I could no longer deny, a bond formed through gestures, glances, and shared silence. As we packed up and prepared to leave, the warmth lingered, the memory of her proximity and the quiet intimacy of our conversation pressing against me like a gentle, insistent pulse. Something had shifted, and I knew, without a word spoken, that nothing between us would ever be quite the same again. The office felt different that evening, even before the workday officially ended. The hum of computers, the faint smell of polished wood, the soft glow of desk lamps, it all seemed quieter, softer, as if the space itself knew something had shifted between us. We had finished the last of the reports, the project complete, and yet I wasn't in a hurry to leave. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that had softened into something warm and steady, and I found myself acutely aware of her presence beside me. As we gathered our things, she lingered near my desk, not out of necessity but, I realized, perhaps because she wanted to. Her eyes met mine, and for a long moment, the rest of the office ceased to exist. The earlier tensions, the unspoken awareness of our feelings, the careful restraint, it all seemed to converge in that gaze. There was no rush, no obligation to speak, just a shared understanding that what existed between us was significant, delicate, and entirely ours. She brushed a stray lock of hair from her face and rested a hand lightly on my arm. The touch was fleeting, just enough to send a warmth up my shoulder and along my chest, yet it lingered in my mind long after her fingers had moved. It wasn't flirtation. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of connection, of permission to recognize what had grown quietly over the past weeks. My own hand itched to respond, to reach for her, but I held it at my side, savoring the weight of the moment rather than disrupting it. "Good work tonight," she said softly, her voice low enough that it felt like it was meant just for me. The compliment carried more than praise for effort. It carried the subtle undercurrent of regard, a recognition of shared effort and shared presence. I felt a warmth flood through me, equal parts pride and relief, because this simple acknowledgement felt intimate in a way words rarely do. We walked toward the exit together, side by side. The hallway lights cast long shadows, and with each step, I felt the quiet rhythm of our proximity, the unspoken understanding of closeness without need for overt demonstration. Her hand brushed mine once more as we passed a narrow corner, the touch barely perceptible yet enough to make my chest tighten with a sense of gentle longing. I realized in that instant that the slow burn of our connection had finally found a resting place, not in dramatic declarations or bold gestures, but in the quiet, deliberate cadence of shared presence. At the doors, she paused, turning to face me fully. Her smile was soft, lingering, and warm. It conveyed everything that words could not: acknowledgement, reassurance, and the quiet promise of more to come. I returned the smile, feeling the tension of weeks dissolve into something calm and hopeful. In that moment, I understood that our story had reached a natural conclusion for now, a moment of satisfaction, a sense of connection fully realized, and the gentle promise of the future waiting beyond the office doors. As she stepped out, I lingered for a heartbeat longer, savoring the warmth she left behind, the quiet gravity of her presence, and the deep, unspoken understanding that this was just the beginning of something quietly extraordinary. The pull between us, once uncertain and tentative, now felt grounded in respect, affection, and the kind of intimacy that made the world outside the office seem distant and insignificant. I walked away with a sense of fulfillment, carrying the warmth of her proximity and the gentle anticipation of what was still to come.